I still remember that morning. Soft sunlight breaking through gray Seattle clouds, the kind of light that makes old wood floors glow like honey. I'd been up since 5, pressing the same beige shirt I used to wear when Ethan was in high school. He once said I looked like a senator in it. Funny how a boy's compliment can follow you into old age. It had been almost 3 years since I'd last seen him. 3 years since the kid I raised like my own got too busy for the man who built his world from the ground up. But I wasn't angry that morning, not even close. I was proud. Ethan had become a respected architect. He had his own firm now, Hale and Partners. His name showed up in city magazines sometimes, and I kept every clipping in a small box beside his old baseball glove. 2 weeks ago, I'd received an invitation. Heavy white cardstock, embossed letters, nothing handwritten. It was for his firm's grand opening downtown. No personal note, no call, but still, I took it as a good sign. Maybe he wanted me there. Maybe he was ready to remember where he came from. I spent the whole morning getting ready, polishing my shoes, fixing my tie, brushing what little hair I had left. My knees groaned as I bent down, but I chuckled anyway. He's gonna be surprised, I told myself. Maybe even proud. The Uber ride was quiet. The driver had the radio on low, old country songs I hadn't heard in years. Outside, the city rolled by in shades of silver and glass, so different from the small house where Ethan had grown up, the one with the creaky porch and the overgrown maple tree out front. I could still see him there, barefoot, sketching houses in a worn-out notebook, saying one day he'd build something that touched the sky. When his parents, my brother and sister-in-law, died in that car crash, Ethan was barely 9. That night, when I found him sitting on the hospital bench, holding his mother's scarf, he looked up and asked me, "Uncle Rob, are you gonna leave me too?" "I'll never leave you, kid," I told him. And I didn't. Not for a single day. The Uber stopped in front of a tall glass building downtown. Hale and Partners. The letters shone like something holy. I stepped out, holding a small gift in my hand, a silver pen with his initials engraved. I thought he'd appreciate that. He always loved thoughtful things. Inside, the lobby was polished marble and soft jazz. People in tailored suits moved like they belonged there. I smiled to myself. Ethan had made it. My boy had really made it. And then I saw him, standing near the center, shaking hands, laughing, looking sharper than I'd ever seen him. My chest swelled. He looked like his father, the same confident grin, the same restless energy. When his eyes met mine, something flickered. Surprise, maybe confusion, then a quick, polite smile. He walked over, his voice warm but cautious. "Uncle Rob. I didn't expect you'd come." "Wow." I grinned. "Couldn't miss it for the world. I had to see what you've built, son." He looked around, a few investors and city officials standing nearby. His smile shifted, more professional now. "Everyone," he said, "this is Robert Hale. He, used to rent the downstairs apartment for my family when I was a kid." The words hit harder than I expected. Used to rent. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. My heart stumbled in my chest. I opened my mouth, just slightly, then closed it again. I looked around at the strangers smiling politely, nodding as if they'd just met another name in passing. One man, tall, wearing glasses, extended a hand. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Hale. So you've known Ethan a long time?" I nodded. "Yeah," I said quietly. "A long time." Ethan laughed at something one of them said and turned back toward the crowd. The conversation moved on without me. I just stood there for a moment, feeling my smile stiffen, not out of pride this time, but restraint. After a while, I found a quiet corner and watched him speak, watched the boy I once taught to tie a tie now introduce others as family, while I was just some old tenant. When he finally took the stage to give his speech, I stayed until the applause died down, then slipped out before dessert. No one noticed. Outside, the air smelled of rain and car exhaust. I looked up at the tall building one last time and whispered, You built something beautiful, Ethan. I just hope someday you build something that lasts longer than pride. That night, back home, I placed the unopened gift on my kitchen table and sat in the quiet. The refrigerator hummed softly, the clock ticked. No anger. No bitterness. Just a stillness that comes when the world finally shows you the truth. Sometimes, silence really is the only way to keep your dignity intact. When Ethan was 9, his whole world ended in a single night. It was early November, the kind of night when rain doesn't just fall, it lingers, whispering against windows like a tired apology. My brother David and his wife, Claire, had gone out for their anniversary dinner. They never made it back. I was at home that evening, fixing a leaky sink when the phone rang. The police officer's voice was calm but heavy. I remember sitting there afterward, staring at the dripping faucet, the steady rhythm almost cruel. I must have sat for an hour before I finally drove to the hospital. Ethan was sitting on a cold bench outside the emergency room, holding his mom's scarf like it was the last piece of her left in the world. His small hands were trembling. When he looked up at me, his eyes weren't crying anymore, they were just empty. "Uncle Rob," he whispered, "they're not coming back, are they?" I knelt down, pulled him close, and said the only thing I could. "No, kid. But I am. And I'll be here as long as you need me." I meant it. And I kept my word. Back then, I was working as a mechanic in a small shop in Tacoma. I didn't have much, just a 2-bedroom house, an old pickup truck, and enough savings to keep the lights on. But I had room in my heart, and that was enough. Ethan moved in the next week. The first few nights were rough, nightmares, sudden tears, the kind of grief that shakes a house in silence. I'd hear him crying in the next room, whispering his mother's name into the dark. I never turned on the light, I'd just sit beside his bed until he fell asleep again. Slowly, days began to find their rhythm. I'd pack his lunch, drive him to school in my old Chevy, and wave at the same crossing guard every morning. In the evenings, he'd sit on the counter while I cooked dinner. Mac and cheese most nights because it was the only thing I could get right. He used to tell me about school, about how the other kids had real families. Once, when he was 10, he asked if we were a real family too. I told him families aren't about matching last names or pictures on a wall. They're about who stays when everyone else leaves. From that day, he stopped calling me Uncle Rob. He just started saying, Dad. The first time he said it, it slipped out accidentally. I was helping him with a math problem, and he muttered, "Dad, can you check this?" I didn't correct him. I couldn't. My throat was too tight for words. That moment, that small, simple word, became everything I lived for. The years rolled on like quiet pages turning. I worked double shifts, sometimes coming home long after dark, just to keep him in private school. I sold my old guitar, my baseball cards, even my wedding ring. My late wife, Laura, would have understood. On weekends, we'd drive out to the lake, just the two of us. He'd fish while I read on the dock, pretending not to notice how bad he was at it. He'd come running every time he caught something, even if it was just a soggy branch, shouting, "Look, Dad! Look!" And every time I'd look, because that joy, it made every sacrifice worth it. He was a bright kid, curious, imaginative, always building things out of scrap wood. I still remember the day he showed me his first drawing of a house. It was uneven and lopsided, but his eyes were glowing. "One day, I'll build houses like this," he said. "Then you'd better study hard," I told him. "And don't forget who taught you how to hold a hammer." He laughed, and for years after, whenever he built something, a birdhouse, a model bridge, a school project, he'd say, "This one's for you, old man." By the time he hit high school, I was already graying at the temples. My hands were rough, knees weaker, but every night I still made it home for dinner. He was popular, smart, kind. Teachers loved him. Girls liked him. I used to joke that he got his charm from me, though we both knew that wasn't true. But somewhere between high school and college, something changed. It wasn't sudden, more like a slow, quiet drift. He started spending more time at his friends' houses, less time with me. He didn't talk about classes anymore. When I'd ask how he was doing, I'd get short answers: fine, busy, got work. At first, I told myself it was normal. Kids grow up, they need space. But sometimes I'd find old photos tucked away in drawers, ones where we stood together, covered in dirt after fixing the roof, or grinning with a burnt Thanksgiving turkey, and I'd realize he hadn't taken a single new picture of us in years. College came, and I was so proud I could barely speak. He got into Washington State with a partial scholarship, but the rest was on me. I cashed out my retirement plan and told him not to worry. He promised he'd pay me back someday. I didn't care if he ever did. During those 4 years, calls grew fewer. He came home for holidays, but each visit felt shorter, like he was somewhere else even when he sat at the same table. The house felt quieter after he left each time. When he graduated, he invited me to the ceremony, but my truck broke down that morning. I still remember standing in the driveway, covered in grease, holding the wrench, listening to the engine cough. I missed it. He didn't pick up my calls that day. Later, I saw the graduation photo online. Him in his cap and gown, smiling with a group of friends. No mention of me. Still, I kept cheering for him from a distance. Every new job, every promotion, I'd hear about it from neighbors or friends of friends. He was moving up fast. I was proud, truly proud, even if I wasn't part of his story anymore. He bought a condo in downtown Seattle. Sleek, expensive, nothing like the cozy old place we shared. When I visited once, he seemed uneasy, like having me there made him nervous. His colleagues stopped by while I was there, young professionals in shiny shoes, and he barely introduced me. Just, "This is Rob. He helped raise me." Helped. That word stuck like a splinter. But I let it go. I told myself he was finding his way. That maybe one day, when the noise of success quieted down, he'd remember who stood behind him through the silence. I went back home to my small house on the edge of Tacoma, where the porch still creaked and the maple trees still leaned too far left. Life got slower. My hands stiffened with age. But I kept his old room just the way he left it. Trophies on the shelf, a few books stacked crookedly, a photo of us at the lake taped to the mirror. Every Sunday, I'd make coffee for 2, 1 cup for me, 1 for the boy who might stop by again someday. Most weeks, that second cup went cold. And still, I never lost faith. Because love, real love, doesn't stop when people change. It just grows quieter, waiting for the right moment to be heard again. I thought maybe that moment had finally come when his invitation arrived, formal, cold, but still, a bridge. What I didn't know was that it would be the day I learned just how far bridges can burn without ever making a sound. After Ethan graduated, I thought things would settle, that the boy who once called me dad would come home, even for a little while. I thought he'd need a break from the noise of the world, maybe crave one of my overcooked Sunday breakfasts or a quiet talk on the porch. But weeks turned into months, and he didn't come. He got a job at a big architectural firm in downtown Seattle. I remember the day I heard about it, not from him, but from a former coworker who read it in a business magazine. "That's your nephew, right?" he'd said, pointing to a glossy photo of Ethan in a suit, shaking hands with the company's CEO. "He's making you proud, huh?" I smiled and said, "Yeah, he's always made me proud." But that night, when I sat alone at my kitchen table, I caught myself wondering when I'd stopped being part of his life enough to know things only through newspapers. Still, I didn't call him. I didn't want to be that old man who guilt-trips his kid for being busy. Love shouldn't beg, it should wait. Months later, Ethan finally showed up at my door, unannounced, wearing a tailored gray suit, holding a takeout bag instead of groceries. "Thought I'd stop by," he said, almost casually. I smiled so wide it hurt. "You don't need a reason, son. Come in, come in." He looked around the house. Same old furniture, same faded curtains. His eyes lingered on the photo of us by the lake. "You still have this up?" he asked, half smiling. "Of course," I said. That was one of the best days of my life. He didn't respond. Instead, he sat down, scrolled through his phone, and said, "So, how's everything here?" It struck me, the distance in that question.
Here.
Not how are you?
Not how's home. Just here. We ate in silence.
I asked about his job. He said he was too busy. I asked if he was seeing anyone. He shrugged. Before leaving, he handed me an envelope. "There's a little something in there," he said, "for groceries or the house." I looked at the envelope and felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. It wasn't the money, it was what it meant. Somewhere along the way, I had become someone to take care of, not someone he turned to for care. After that visit, months passed again. His calls came only on holidays, short, polite, like something he scheduled between meetings. I learned more about his life from LinkedIn than from him. New job title, new office, new circle of people who probably didn't know I existed. Sometimes I'd write him an email, nothing heavy, just a "hope you're doing well, kid." He'd reply days later with a "Thanks, Uncle Rob. Been swamped, we'll call soon."
He never did. I didn't stop trying.
I'd drive by his office building sometimes, not to see him, but just to feel closer to the life I helped him build. I'd watch from across the street as he walked out with colleagues, laughing, carrying blueprints or coffee. I'd smile unseen and whisper, "That's my boy." Then came his first big promotion. It made the local paper again, youngest partner in Northwest Design Group. I cut out the article, pinned it to my fridge, and thought about calling him to say congratulations.
Before I could, he called me.
"Hey, Uncle Rob," he said, cheerful and distracted. "Listen, I'm having a little get-together this weekend. Just a small party to celebrate. You should come by." My heart lifted.
Of course.
Wouldn't miss it. He sent me the address, a penthouse condo overlooking the bay. I bought a bottle of good wine, even though I hadn't had a drink in years. When I arrived, the place was full of people in polished shoes and expensive smiles. Ethan greeted me with a quick hug and moved on to his guests. At first, I stood by the window, watching the harbor lights. Then, as I turned to find a seat, I heard someone ask, "Hey Ethan, who's the older guy by the window?" He laughed lightly. "That's just Rob, an old family friend. He helped out a lot when I was a kid."
I froze. Just Rob.
He wasn't cruel. He wasn't mocking me. But he erased me, neatly, efficiently, like I was a detail that didn't fit the new design of his life. For the rest of the night, I stayed quiet. Smiled when spoken to. Left before the music got too loud. When I reached home, I placed the half-full bottle of wine on the counter and sat in silence. That night, I realized something painful. Not every betrayal comes with anger or lies. Sometimes it comes quietly, disguised as distance. Years went by. Ethan's career skyrocketed. He opened his own firm, traveled internationally, gave TED Talks about vision and leadership. I watched them online, every single one. He always thanked his mentors, his professors, his team. Never once mentioned the man who held his world together when it was falling apart.
I didn't resent him.
I just stopped expecting anything. Expectations, I've learned, are a form of self-inflicted hope. One day, I got a call from a reporter asking for a quote. "You're listed as Robert Hale, the man who rented out space to Ethan's family when he was young," she said. "Could you share what he was like as a tenant's kid?"
For a moment, I couldn't breathe.
That's how he remembered me, not as the man who raised him, but as someone who rented from his parents. I laughed quietly into the receiver.
"He was a good kid," I said.
"Always dreamed big." Then I hung up before my voice could tremble. The days after that were long and slow. I took more walks by the lake, fed the ducks, read the same old novels I'd read 20 times. I wasn't lonely, not really. Just aware that my chapter in his story had closed long before I realized it. Then came the invitation, his firm's grand opening.
No note. No phone call.
Just an envelope in the mail with my name printed, nothing personal. I held it for a long time before opening it. Maybe it was guilt that made him send it.
Maybe obligation.
Or maybe, and this was the thought I wanted to believe, maybe it was his way of saying he still cared. I told myself it was enough. I told myself this was the moment everything would come full circle, that he'd finally say, "This is my uncle, the man who raised me." But when the day came, when he stood there in that glass building with his polished shoes and perfect smile, and introduced me as an old tenant, something inside me went quiet.
Not broken. Just quiet. I didn't hate him.
I didn't even feel betrayed anymore. What I felt was heavier, like I had been erased from his memory, piece by piece, until nothing was left but a faint outline of a man who once mattered. After that day, I didn't reach out again.
Weeks passed. The phone stayed silent. No calls, no messages. I didn't expect any.
I spent my mornings tending to the small garden behind the house. Tomatoes, mint, a few wildflowers that grew wherever they pleased. Life returned to its gentle rhythm, the one I'd always known before Ethan came into it. Then, one evening, as rain tapped softly on the window, I found myself pulling out the old box I kept under my bed, the one filled with newspaper clippings, school drawings, and faded photographs. There he was, missing teeth, mud on his face, standing beside the birdhouse we built together. I traced his smile with my thumb.
"You were my boy," I whispered.
"You always will be, even if the world doesn't remember it." And that's when I understood something I never had before. Love, when it's real, doesn't need recognition.
It just is.
Still, that night, I couldn't help but wonder, what happens when life teaches him the same lesson? Would he finally see what he'd thrown away? Would the man who erased me ever know what it feels like to be forgotten? The world has a quiet way of balancing things. And I had a feeling even then, that balance was on its way.
I didn't sleep much after that night.
For a few days I tried to shake it off, told myself that maybe Mark had just spoken clumsily, that maybe he hadn't meant to erase me. But denial only delays truth, and the truth always finds its way in silence. The next morning, as I watered the small patch of lilies outside my house, I caught my reflection in the window, a tired old man still waiting for a kind word that would never come. And that's when I decided I would stop waiting. Not for an apology. Not for recognition.
But for clarity.
Mark had built his new office in a part of town that once belonged to me, metaphorically at least. I had friends there. People who knew what I'd done for that boy. A few of them still worked at the old city planning department, the same place where I'd once submitted the permits that got his career started. Out of curiosity, I paid one of them a visit, a quiet man named Daniel, an engineer I'd mentored long ago. We met for coffee, the same way we always used to when I was still working. "Henry," he said, smiling, "you don't age, do you? Still sharp as ever." "Sharp enough to notice things," I said. "Tell me, Daniel, this new firm of Mark's, how did he get that government contract so fast?"
Daniel hesitated.
"You know how it works.
Connections.
Favors." But his paperwork was, well, let's just say it looked a little too perfect. I didn't press him for more, but a thought began forming quietly in my mind, not of revenge but of balance. If Mark had built his empire on shortcuts, perhaps fate would give me a way to remind him where truth stands. That night, I opened the old box that held all of Mark's childhood memories, his drawings, report cards, and even the first architectural sketches I'd helped him trace. Underneath them lay something I hadn't touched in years, copies of the property deeds and city permits from when I owned the old house he grew up in. And there, among the yellowed papers, I found something interesting, a joint document. When Mark was starting out, I'd added my name as a secondary signatory for his first property deal, just to help him get a bank loan. I had forgotten about it completely. The loan had been in both our names. And technically, the title had never been transferred fully to him, he'd never finalized it. It wasn't about the property. God knows I didn't care about land or money anymore. But sometimes, forgotten papers tell deeper truths. Who helped you, who stood behind you when you had nothing. I made a copy of the file, placed it neatly in an envelope, and left it on my desk. I didn't plan to use it, not to hurt him. But something inside me whispered, let him see it. Let him remember. A week later, I received a call.
It was his assistant.
Mr. Carter, this is Emily from Mark's office. Mr. Bennett wanted to know if you could stop by. There's something important he'd like to discuss. I smiled faintly.
Of course, I said.
Tell him I'll come tomorrow. When I arrived, Mark's face looked different, tight around the edges, a little uneasy. He wasn't wearing his charming smile this time.
He motioned for me to sit. Uncle Henry.
I didn't realize you still had access to some of my old property files, he began carefully. I met his eyes, calm and steady.
Ah, so you saw it. He shifted in his chair.
Emily found it while organizing the archives. I just wanted to make sure there's no misunderstanding.
There isn't, I said simply. You were young. I helped you.
I never needed anything back. He nodded, forcing a smile.
Right. Of course.
I appreciate everything you did. But his voice wavered slightly, the voice of a man afraid of a past he tried to bury. Before leaving, I set the envelope gently on his desk.
You don't owe me gratitude, Mark, I said. Just truth.
Always remember that truth doesn't fade with success, it waits quietly.
Then I left. Days turned into weeks.
I went back to my quiet routine, morning walks, old music, evening tea. But something in Mark had shifted. He began calling once in a while, small talk at first, then longer conversations about work and life. He invited me to dinner again, this time privately, no guests, no speeches. I accepted. When I arrived, he seemed more human, less polished. There was a nervous kindness in his voice. Uncle Henry, he said as he poured the tea, I've been thinking a lot lately. About the old days. About how I treated you.
I smiled. You don't have to think too much about that, son.
We all lose sight of where we came from when the lights get too bright.
He looked down, ashamed.
I shouldn't have said what I said at the opening. That was wrong of me. Maybe, I said softly, but it taught me something valuable.
He looked up, confused.
What's that? That silence, I said, is sometimes louder than anger.
He didn't speak after that.
For a long while we just sat there, an old man and the boy he'd raised, separated by pride and years, reunited by truth. Later, word spread that one of Mark's projects had hit trouble. A government inspection revealed irregularities in the permits, the same kind Daniel had mentioned. He wasn't charged, but the embarrassment forced him to pull back from several deals. The newspapers that once celebrated him went quiet. One evening, I received a visit. Mark stood at my door, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. I just needed to see you, he said. Everything's falling apart. I motioned for him to sit. He did, like he had when he was a child, eyes full of guilt. I thought I could build everything on my own, he whispered. But I guess I built too fast. You built without roots, I said gently. And roots are not in money or fame, Mark. They're in people who stayed when you had nothing. He nodded, eyes wet. I know. I forgot that. I forgot you. I placed my hand on his. Forgetting is part of growing up. Remembering is what makes you a man. He looked up, searching my face for anger, for reproach, but found none. Only calm, quiet acceptance. And in that silence, I could feel something shift again. Not revenge. Not victory. Just balance. That night after he left, I sat by the window watching the rain. It fell softly against the glass, rhythmic and cleansing. Somewhere between the drops, I realized my revenge had already happened, not through schemes or payback, but through truth catching up. He had been humbled by life, not by me. And sometimes, that's the most merciful form of justice there is. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you, God. You let me stay silent, and still be heard." The days after Mark's visit felt unusually quiet, not empty but peaceful. For the first time in years, I sensed a strange stillness inside me, as if something heavy had finally settled into its rightful place. There was no more bitterness, no more waiting for him to call, no more silent expectations. I had done what life required of me. I had raised him, loved him, guided him. The rest was his journey. But fate has a way of bringing unfinished stories full circle, sometimes softly, sometimes with a whisper instead of thunder. A few weeks later, I received a letter in the mail, not typed, not stamped with a company logo, but handwritten, trembling slightly as if the writer had hesitated with every word.
It was from Mark. Uncle Henry.
I don't know how to start this. Every time I sit down to write, I end up staring at the paper for hours. I've been thinking about everything, what you did for me, how I erased your name to make mine shine. I can't explain it except to say, I was ashamed. Not of you, but of myself. I thought acknowledging your part in my life would make people think I hadn't earned my success. I thought I had to appear self-made. But all I did was erase the very man who made me possible. You were never my tenant, Uncle Henry.
You were my home.
If you'll allow it, I'd like to come see you again. This time, not as a successful man, not as a nephew seeking forgiveness, but as a son who remembers where he came from.
Mark.
I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in my coat pocket. There were no tears, just a quiet smile, the kind that comes when life finally makes sense. That evening, I brewed an extra cup of tea. I didn't know if he would actually come, but I set it on the table anyway.
The clock ticked softly.
And then, around dusk, I heard the knock. When I opened the door, there he was. No suit, no expensive watch, no entourage. Just Mark, standing in the cold, hands tucked in his pockets, a simple look of remorse on his face.
I didn't think you'd actually come, I said. I almost didn't, he admitted.
But then I remembered something you used to tell me when I was a kid. Courage isn't in fighting others, it's in facing yourself. He smiled weakly. So, here I am. We talked for hours that night. About his struggles, the scandal that had nearly ruined his firm, the sleepless nights, the regret. He confessed everything, not to seek sympathy, but to set himself free. I kept wondering why everything was falling apart, he said, staring at the floor. And then I realized, I built everything on pride. You can't build anything strong when the foundation is pride.
I nodded slowly.
Pride builds towers that collapse. Humility builds homes that last. He looked at me with tears glistening in his eyes. You should hate me.
I shook my head.
Hate is for those still waiting to win. I've already won, son, not over you but over myself. He didn't understand at first, but he didn't argue. He just leaned back silent. A few weeks passed, and slowly, I began to see change in him. He started visiting often, helping me with groceries, fixing small things around the house, even joining me for morning walks. The neighbors noticed and asked, "Is that your son?" And for the first time, I didn't correct anyone. I just smiled and said, "Yes.
He's my boy."
One afternoon, he brought over a folder. "Uncle Henry, I want to show you something," he said, setting it on the table. Inside were sketches, new building plans, but different from his earlier modern glass towers. These were community centers, libraries, homes for veterans, and affordable housing designs. "I'm starting a foundation," he explained, "for kids who can't afford architecture school. I'm naming it after you, the Henry Carter Foundation."
I looked up sharply. "No, Mark.
You don't need to do that."
"I do," he said firmly.
"It's not about guilt. It's about truth. You gave me a life. This is my way of saying your name will never be forgotten again." My throat tightened, but I stayed composed. "If you're doing it for good, not vanity, then I'll bless it." He smiled, the same innocent smile he had when he was a boy holding up his first drawing for me to see. A few months later, the foundation launched quietly, without press, without grand speeches. Just a simple plaque on a modest building that read, "The Henry Carter Foundation, built in gratitude, standing in truth." I didn't attend the opening ceremony. I told him I preferred to watch from afar. And I did, sitting on a park bench across the street, sipping coffee, watching students file in through the glass doors. I could hear faint music from inside, laughter, the hum of young ambition. It reminded me of the sound that once filled my home decades ago, when a smaller version of Mark used to stay up late sketching by the window. I whispered to myself, "You did it, son. You finally remembered."
Time moved on, and so did peace.
Mark rebuilt his career, but this time with integrity. He learned to speak with humility, to treat people kindly, to give credit where it was due. He often told people, "Everything I am, I owe to a man who taught me patience before success." He never used the word tenant again. One winter evening, he invited me to dinner at his home.
This time, I didn't hesitate.
The dining room was warm, softly lit. On the wall hung a framed photo, me younger, holding his hand at his college graduation. Beneath it was a small brass plate engraved with words that nearly broke me. He raised me when I was lost. He loved me when I had nothing. He taught me that silence can be the loudest truth. I couldn't speak for a long while. I simply touched the frame, then looked at him. He smiled, and for the first time, it felt like family again, not by blood but by choice. Months later, he asked if I'd like to join one of his foundation's lectures for the students.
I agreed.
When I entered the hall, hundreds of young faces turned toward me, curious and respectful. Mark stepped up to the podium and began. "I want to tell you about a man who never shouted, never fought, but somehow changed my life completely. He taught me that revenge isn't about hurting others, it's about healing yourself through patience and integrity." He turned toward me and said, "Mr. Henry Carter, would you please say a few words?" I stood slowly, leaning slightly on my cane. The room went silent. "I don't have much to say," I began. "Only this: when someone wrongs you, don't let their shadow darken your peace. The world has a way of setting things right when you stay honest and calm. Sometimes, silence truly is the best revenge." The hall erupted in quiet applause, not loud, not chaotic, but deeply respectful. And as I looked at those young faces, I realized something. My life hadn't been wasted on pain or betrayal. It had been invested in something that finally grew back, just in a different form. That night, when Mark dropped me home, he hugged me before leaving. It was the kind of hug that says all the words men rarely speak: "I'm sorry. I love you. Thank you." After he drove away, I stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker. And in that soft golden glow, I felt at peace. The kind that doesn't come from revenge, but from resolution. Justice, I whispered to myself, doesn't always knock loudly. Sometimes, it just walks back into your life, quietly carrying your name. The older I get, the quieter my mornings become. I wake before the sun most days, when the world still feels half asleep. The kettle hums softly, the scent of coffee fills the room, and I sit by the same window where I've watched decades of seasons pass. Spring's first blush, summer's light, autumn's surrender, and winter's long, gentle silence. I don't mind the quiet anymore. I used to fear it once, mistaking it for loneliness. But I've learned something: silence isn't emptiness. It's space. Space where truth can breathe. And in that space, I often think about Mark. It's been several years since the night he came back into my life. The foundation continues to grow. He still calls me every Sunday evening, sometimes just to ask if I've eaten, sometimes to share stories about the students he's mentoring. He's different now. Softer around the edges, more grounded. When he speaks, I can hear that the boy I raised has finally returned, hidden beneath the layers of pride that once blinded him. Every time he calls me Dad, I feel something inside me settle. Not pride, something deeper. Peace. Last week, he insisted I visit his office. Not the tall glass tower he once flaunted, but the new one, modest, warm, built from recycled wood and sunlight. He designed it himself, he said, to feel human. When I entered, the receptionist smiled and said, "Welcome, Mr. Carter. Mark's father, right?"
For a moment, I couldn't speak.
I just nodded and said quietly, "Yes.
That's me."
Inside, the walls were lined with framed sketches, not of skyscrapers, but of homes, schools, and community spaces. And on one corner of his desk sat a photo, me and him, sitting on the porch of our old house, both laughing, unaware that time would one day test that bond so cruelly. He noticed me looking at it and said, "I keep it there as a reminder of where everything started." I smiled and replied, "And of what really matters."
He nodded.
Exactly. On the drive back home, I thought about the journey, not just his but mine too. How I'd once raised a boy out of love, only to be forgotten in my old age. How I'd felt the sting of betrayal, but refused to let it harden my heart. And how, in the end, patience did what anger never could, it healed. It took me nearly 70 years to understand that revenge isn't about hurting someone. It's about refusing to let their actions destroy your peace. And forgiveness, true forgiveness, isn't saying it's okay. It's saying, it no longer controls me. Sometimes, when the evening light fades and I hear the distant laughter of children playing in the neighborhood, I imagine a younger version of myself sitting beside a small boy named Mark, teaching him how to draw straight lines.
"Steady hand," I used to say.
"Patience makes the line perfect." And in a way, life is just that, a series of lines drawn with patience.
Some wobble. Some break.
But if you keep your hand steady long enough, the picture still turns out beautiful. There's one more thing I never told Mark. Maybe I'll tell him someday. When he introduced me as his old tenant, I nearly left that event with bitterness boiling in my chest. But when I reached home that night, I looked around at my small house, my quiet room, the photographs on the wall, and I realized something important. I hadn't lost anything. He hadn't taken away my dignity. He had only revealed the depth of his own emptiness. The truth is, no one can take from you what's rooted in peace. And peace, once found, doesn't break, not even under betrayal. Every now and then, I still visit the foundation. The students there always greet me with smiles, some calling me Mr. Carter, others Grandpa Henry. They don't know the full story. They don't need to. All they know is that a man once helped build something for them, and that's enough. I watch them draw, laugh, plan their futures. And I think, this is how justice looks when it grows up.
Quiet. Kind. Lasting.
A few nights ago, Mark brought me to dinner at his home again. This time his wife joined us, and so did his little daughter, Emma, a bright, curious child with her father's eyes. Halfway through the meal, she climbed onto my lap and asked, "Grandpa Henry, Daddy says you taught him everything. Is that true?" I laughed softly. "Not everything, sweetheart. Just how to live without losing your heart." She thought for a moment, then smiled. "That sounds like a lot." And in her innocence, I found the perfect summary of my life. When they dropped me home that night, I stood at the door watching them leave, hand in hand, the headlights fading into the quiet street. A gentle wind brushed past my face, carrying the faint scent of rain. I looked up at the sky, whispering to no one in particular, "It's enough. I've seen what I needed to see." Now, as I write these words in my worn-out notebook, I realize that life has its own rhythm of justice. It doesn't always come when we demand it. Sometimes, it waits until we're calm enough to receive it. And when it does arrive, quietly, gracefully, it doesn't roar. It simply rests in your heart like a sigh of relief. People often ask me if I ever truly forgave Mark. I tell them this, yes. Because forgiveness wasn't for him, it was for me. Before I sleep each night, I whisper a small prayer, not for success, not for revenge, but for gratitude. For the boy I raised, who once lost his way but found his truth. For the pain that taught me patience. And for the silence that became my greatest teacher. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear my younger self saying to that scared little boy, "Don't worry, Mark. I'll never leave you. And even after all these years, I realize, I never did.
Not in anger. Not in pride.
I stayed quietly in the background of his conscience, until he finally remembered where he came from.
That's not revenge.
That's legacy. Final reflection. If I could leave one message behind, it would be this. When someone betrays you, don't rush to prove your worth.
Don't shout. Don't curse.
Just keep walking, quietly, steadily. Because truth doesn't need to chase.
It waits.
And when the time is right, it stands taller than every lie. And as I close this chapter of my life, I realize, I didn't lose a nephew. I helped a man find his soul.
And that is peace.